Great. Well, welcome everyone. Just want to double check that the attendees can hear us. You can, I think, give us raise a hand or put something into the Q&A, so that we can make sure that, yeah, we've got it. Okay. Excellent. Great. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. I'm Indre Viscontis. I'm the current president of the Society for the Neuroscience of Creativity, and this is our fall event. And we are delighted to be co-hosting this particular panel with APA Division 10. And I have Ronnie Ryder-Paulman, who's the president of APA Division 10, joining me moderating this session. Just before we begin, I wanted to give you a quick update of some of the things that the Society for Neuroscience of Creativity has been up to. Here's a list of our executive committee and organizing committee members. We have this virtual fall event, in which we sort of talk about some of the details of the methods that we are using in terms of measuring outcomes, in this case of the impact of the arts on health and well-being. And then we also have another session in a little bit about navigating careers in creativity research. And that can mean anything from the academic route to the industry route. And so we have a number of panelists who can speak to how it is that we can build careers as creativity researchers in a time where creativity, in our humble but accurate opinion, has never been more important. We see a lot of changes coming down with the disruption that generative artificial intelligence is bringing to our workforce. And we see that employers are very much valuing creativity. And that's also seems to be the case in a lot of other venues. And so I think the research that we do is really critical in ensuring that we have accurate perceptions of what creativity is, how we can enhance it, what are the ways in which it can be useful, and also what are the elements that prevent us from being our most creative selves. So that's where we'll talk about the careers. And then we wanted to end on a more positive note. So we have a version of our crosstalk series in which we pair a scientist with a practitioner in a domain of creativity. And in this case, we're going to talk about humor and comedy. And so I think that that's going to be a really great way to end this fall day as we talk about what is the science behind comedy and the creativity that goes into that. So I just want to, again, welcome you all. Thank you all for coming. And to a couple more SFNC announcements that we want to give. So we have our in-person annual meeting coming up in May. It will be in Paris at the Institut du Cerveau at the Sorbonne. And we are going to be next to the hospital in which Broca made his discoveries and worked with patients and clinical populations. So we have chosen a theme in line with that history, looking at how changing the brain also changes creativity, whether that's through neurodegeneration or some other neurological issue, or whether it's with the kinds of tools that we have today that allow us to change our brains temporarily without being invasive. But of course, any research related to creativity and neuroscience of creativity in particular is welcome. We are going to be opening up our abstract submissions on December 2nd and closing them on January 15th. We chose this relatively large window because we want to be able to make some early decisions for those of you who need to know sooner rather than later if you are going to be presenting in Paris for funding reasons. If you're coming from the US or other places and you need a little bit more time to generate the funding to go to the conference since it's in Paris this year. So you can, there will be a part in the forum where you can let us know whether you need an early decision, and we can tell you early on whether or not your abstract has been accepted, but we might not know whether it's been accepted for a talk or a poster. That might happen a little bit later, but we are trying to accommodate people that need these earlier deadlines by having this large submission window. And so we will share the instructions for submission through our newsletter and our listserv and on our website. So if you haven't signed up for the SFMC emails, please, you can do that on our website. And also we have awards that we are going to be giving out at our annual conference, and the nomination period is the same as the abstract deadline. So we have a Young Investigator Award, we have our Dissertation Award, and we have a Sarah A. Burgess Award. So to look at the eligibility criteria and requirements, you can go to that link on our website. And again, nominate either yourself or one of your colleagues or mentors or students in that nomination period. Roger Beatty, who's the president-elect of the SFMC, is going to be serving as the lead for our awards. So thank you very much. And so we want to welcome APA Division 10 in this co-hosted event. So Ronnie, why don't you say hello?
Sure thing. Oh, let me start. My video is not working here, so thank you very much for joining us. I'm really excited to have this collaboration with SFNC. Our goal is that, given the limited number of creativity researchers, that we have these collaborations and cross-fertilization across these different organizations that study creativity. So if any of you are interested in creativity, aesthetics, or arts, please reach out to me. I could tell you more about Division 10 of the APA, which focuses on these topics. We have a small but mighty membership, and we have our own conference as well, which I want to call your attention to. The initial deadline has passed, but if you're interested in submitting a poster, there is another deadline for that, January 24th, with quick decisions. The conference itself is in New Haven, hosted by Yale University in March. So again, if you have questions about the division, becoming a member of the division, you don't need to be an APA member to join the division, our journal, or the conference. I'm happy to answer either in the chat or reach out to me via email directly. And thank you, Roger, for putting the link for the conference.
Great. So let's get started with our first panel. So this is a panel in which we want to talk about the impact of creativity on health and other outcomes and how we measure that. I think this is a really important conversation, as there's been this big explosion in interest in what is the neuroarts field now, as it's been coined. And we want to talk about how it is that you can measure something as messy as creativity and its impact on health. So we have 4 excellent panelists that Ronnie and I will be co-moderating a conversation with. Anjan Chatterjee is professor of neurology, psychology, and architecture at the University of Pennsylvania, and he's the founding director of the Penn Center for Neuroaesthetics. He's a past neurology chair at Pennsylvania Hospital, and his research addresses neuroaesthetics, spatial cognition, language, and neuroethics. Welcome, Anjan.
Thank you.
And Thalia Goldstein is an associate professor and director of applied developmental psychology at the George Mason University, where she directs the Play Learning Arts and Youth Lab and also co-directs the Mason Arts Research Center, which is a National Endowment for the Arts lab. She's been published in more than 70 articles, funded by the National Science Foundation and the National Endowment for the Arts and the Templeton Foundation. And her research focuses on children's and adolescents' social and emotional development through engagement with pretend play and the arts. Welcome, Thalia.
Thanks so much for having me.
Jennifer Drake is an associate professor of psychology at Brooklyn College and the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. And her research program focuses on the psychology of the visual arts. So she examines the affective benefits of engaging in the visual arts for children and adults. And she also studies the cognitive and perceptual skills underlying drawing ability in artistically gifted children and adult artists. Welcome, Jennifer.
Thank you for having me. Hi, everyone.
And Jessica Hoffmann is the Director of Implementation Science at the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence. She's an assistant professor in the Yale Child Study Center. And she specializes in working within school settings to develop approaches and programming aimed at enhancing children's creativity, promoting positive school climates, and enhancing mental health. And her current research focuses on the efficacy of two such programs for secondary schools that examine the impact of emotion skills instruction on school climate, creative problem solving, and emotion regulation activity. Welcome, Jessica.
Hello, thank you for having me.
So Christine, can we remove the slides so that we can see all the panelists, please? Thank you. So as you can all tell, this is a really esteemed panel with a lot of different domain specificity represented. So we thought we'd get started with a bit of an overview. So Anjan, can you tell us about your approach to the aesthetic triad and how you think we should think about measuring the impact of something that I think we intuitively feel is really powerful, but sometimes it's hard to quantify?
Sure. So thanks, Indra and Ronnie, for hosting this. And I would be remiss if I didn't at least mention the big elephant in the room, which is how, for many of us, today sucks. And I want to contextualize this to bring it to our conversation. Earlier in the week, when I was meeting with the undergrads who are in my lab, our topic of discussion was, can aesthetic experiences and creativity be a way to deal with stress and to deal with specifically acute stress? And I would pose this as a question to the whole community, given the times we're in. And I'm going to come back to that towards the end of my comments. So to start with, I think along with Doshin Vartanian, I've written about the aesthetic triad, and doesn't even qualify as a model. It's really a framework, and it's a framework through which we can talk about, particularly if you're an experimentalist, what parts of this complex phenomena we're addressing when you're constructing experiments and you're building up a kind of landscape of what might be going on. And so the first part of the triad has to do with the nature of our sensory and motor systems, that the design of our sensory systems, whether we're talking about vision or audition or touch, creates certain conditions and constraints on the kind of experiences we can have, as well as our motor systems. So the way in which our motor systems are organized, or have a role to play in how we experience art, and in very explicit ways, how we experience dance, but also other kinds of art. We've shown that people with Parkinson's, for example, who have motor disorders, have a different experience of artwork in which there's a lot of implicit motion, for example. The other side of the other part of the second part of the triad is the way in which processing this information has an effect on our emotions. When we're talking about beauty, it's typically reward and the nature of our reward systems. But aesthetic experiences are complicated. They don't have to just be simple pleasures. We've just been through Halloween. People will voluntarily engage in experiences that otherwise might be horrific. And this can be an aesthetic experience. So what's going on there? And the kind of cocktail of emotions that all contribute to a rich aesthetic experience. And finally, the third of the triad is our semantics, our knowledge system. This is where our individual differences in the context of our backgrounds, our culture, our education come into play in a way that we experience different kind of art, for example. So a very common, a robust finding in empirical aesthetics is that people who've had a lot of experience with art, for example, appreciate art differently. In particular, abstract art there seems to be a real division between people who have some knowledge of art versus not. So that's the overall framework. And the question we've been trying to address for a few years is, how do we understand, how do we start to tap into what people's experience is beyond what has historically been true in empirical aesthetics, is asking people about, do they find something beautiful? Do they like it? Do they find it interesting? And that is kind of a common, sort of has been the norm in the field, I'd say, for the last 50 years or so. But things are changing, and there are a variety of labs that are all addressing, I think, what is a similar issue right now. And I'll at least tell you how we've done it. And it might help to talk about this in terms of an analogy. And the analogy is that if you are experiencing a complex sensory experience, let's say wine tasting or bourbon tasting or whatever you're, whatever you like, many people can say, I like it, I don't like it, I find it interesting, and then they get stuck. And sometimes people will get stuck, and then if they are provided with the vocabulary, like a sommelier might say, hints of berries, a little bit of chocolate, so on, caramel, and then it's easier for people to identify those tastes in the same way that a truism in psychology is it's much easier to match things than to generate things, right? So if you can match the taste, you start to enrich the kind of experience you're having, and we believe and we think that this makes for a richer experience. So the way we went about this was to try to describe a taxonomy, a vocabulary of aesthetic experiences. And we started out with a number of different experts. Many of you know Ellen Winner, who's a psychologist, Noel Carroll, who's a philosopher. We had a theologian, an art historian, and we met several times to really try to come up with as much of a vocabulary as we could for the possible impacts that art could have. And from that, we derived 69 terms, and then we crowdsourced that. So Alex Christensen, who many of you know, he's been quite involved in the world of creativity, used semantic network analyses, and we came up with a semantic map of this that could coalesce into 11 dimensions, and just to simplify it, that could further coalesce into 4 broad dimensions, which end up being positive affect, negative affect, a kind of immersive state, and a potential for transformation, right? So those seem to be the 4 big categories. And this becomes a granularity question, which is, again, if you're trying to probe this, do you ask 69 questions? That's not always feasible. Do you ask 4? Sometimes it's too coarse. And so, we have some thoughts about how to go about doing this. One of the things we're interested in is that there is that kind of close to negative affect, this whole idea of challenging and upsetting kinds of experiences, that seems to shift in one direction to generating interest and then potential transformation. And in the other direction, it goes to people feeling overwhelmed and sad and depressed. And so going back to where I started, this, I think, is a challenge for us as a community to understand, under challenging experiences, what pushes people into anxiety and depression, and what pushes people into being engaged and using difficult circumstances as a vehicle for transformation. And so anyway, now that we have our taxonomy, we've used it in a handful of studies, which I can talk about, but I think this is enough to at least frame the conversation.
Yes, thank you. That's really helpful. And I think, I think the taxonomy is something that a number of us have been really thinking deeply about. And there's a couple of initiatives, some sort of originating within SFNC, but also in other organizations to really try to get to a common vocabulary, not just of what are the terms that we use, but also how they're related to one another. What's the overlap? What do they mean? So thank you for that. So I just wanted each of the panelists to kind of give us a sense of sort of the kinds of measures they use. So Thalia, why don't we start with you? You measure, theater, education, and drama on kids. That sounds really hard. How do you do that?
It is really hard. Yeah, thank you. So when I started doing work in this area of theater and its effects, the main perspectives in the field at that time, and sort of continue to this day, is this perspective of transfer, which is this idea of if you are learning how to do theater or you are engaged in a show or a play, you're learning how to act. And this idea of transfer is when you're learning how to do these things, what are the skills and abilities that then you can grow through engaging in these kinds of artistic activities and apply in other domains? So this idea of transfer isn't just looked at in theater, of course. It's looked at in the visual arts. It's looked at in music. It's looked at in visual arts training. And it really was the guiding and organizing principle for a lot of empirical and experimental research in the arts for a very long time, which is this idea of if you give kids a lot of music classes, are their math scores going to go up on the SATs? Or if you have kids spend a long time learning how to draw and learning the visual arts, will they become more observational and have better perception, say in a biology class or in a science lab? In theater, this focus has always been around sort of interpersonal relationships between people, specifically empathy. If you ask theater teachers, which we've done in my lab, what do you think theater teaches kids? The number one answer is always empathy. It teaches them how to think about the minds of other people, how to have sympathy and compassion for what other people are going through, and how to take their perspective. And so when I began doing research on what happens when kids do theater classes and engage in theater activities, that was sort of the first thing that we went after. And the way that we did this was basically to ask a bunch of kids who had done theater training and a bunch of kids who had not done theater training about their levels of empathy, using fairly standard measures in psychology and developmental psychology to measure things like how easily and readily do you take the perspectives of other people? Can you solve stories and tasks and problems where we're asking you about the beliefs and emotions and motivations of the people in those stories and tasks and problems? And what was really interesting was we did this work correlationally, right? Just looking at kids who were in theater and kids who weren't, and then progressed over time to quasi-experimental and even randomized control trials of students from kindergarten all the way through high school who had been involved in theater classes and students who hadn't been involved in theater classes, or students who we paid to take theater classes and students who took other kinds of classes. And what came out of about a decade of work from my lab and several other labs looking at the effects of theater on different kinds of social and emotional skills like empathy was that we didn't have a firm yes. Even though teachers truly believed that this is what they were teaching their students, what we found was that it was only for some students under some circumstances. Sometimes a randomized control trial, you'd find positive effects of a theater intervention on one element of empathy, which is the reduction of personal distress, which is that you have to sort of lower your own distress response to other people to then be able to empathize with them. But we wouldn't find it on other parts of empathy like compassion or altruism or sympathy, right? So after about a decade of doing this work and having all of these varied results based on age group, based on measurement strategy, based on whether it was a controlled trial or a quasi-experimental study, what my lab and I decided to do was go back to the source and go back to the foundation. And as you mentioned, the arts are sort of messy. Creativity is messy, right? It's a humanist, human endeavor that has the complexities of your context, of your background, and of your time and your space, and sort of all of these other elements that go into real world human behavior. And so in order to try and break that down into component parts and really take a look at what was going on the ground, we decided to do just a naturalistic observational study that we then subjected to qualitative analyses called grounded theory analyses. So we went into the field, we measured 56 hours of acting classes across a wide variety of schools. And then we took those films and subjected them to this qualitative analysis in order to look at what kinds of themes, ideas, and psychological constructs emerged. So in my lab group, we've really tried to approach this messiness of the real world art form from a bunch of different perspectives, with the idea that eventually we will put all of the pieces together to get at where there are effects, when there are effects, and eventually whether those effects transfer.
You know, I think what you're describing is a really important point, which is that sometimes it's unclear to us when there's an intuition, whether the measures that we have are the ones that are failing us or whether that intuition is incorrect. And I think that, you know, sometimes it can be easy for us to feel like, well, let's just throw up our hands and say, well, then we can't measure this. But as you're describing, when you go deeper into understanding what these outcomes might be, one of the consequences is that then you can really figure out what elements of the intervention are working, and how they're working, and how do we optimize that for everybody, not just for the subset of students that maybe are the ones that you know, seem to be showing those benefits more clearly.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing to keep in mind is while we're struggling with defining creativity and the semantic terms within aesthetics, there's a whole parallel conversation happening in the world of empathy researchers and social skills researchers who are also trying to figure out what all these different empathy terms are, what they mean, and how they work either in parallel or completely as separate constructs, both neurologically and behaviorally. So the combination of the two can be challenging on multiple levels.
Yeah. So Jen, children's drawings or even adult drawings, what are the tools that you use to understand and evaluate them? And, you know, how, I mean, that again seems like one of these problems that, you know, has a lot of subjectivity potentially embedded in it. So how do you deal with that?
Sure. And thank you so much for having me. It's really exciting to be here, and thank you all for attending. So my work looks at how drawing can be used to regulate our emotions, important skill for adults, but it is a very important milestone, a developmental milestone for children. So learning how to monitor and adjust their emotions to an appropriate level of intensity. This is something that parents help from early infancy. And I just realized the fire alarm is going off in my office, so hopefully I won't have to evacuate, but we'll see in my building. Usually security comes around and kicks us out, so I'll try my best here.
We won't be offended if you just
No,
get
it's
up.
okay. I'll just try my best here. But so parents play an important role up until adolescence. So having parents and educators know what kind of tools or strategies children can engage in is important to helping them to regulate their emotions. So in my work, I'm working with 6 to 12-year-olds, and I selected this age group because it is an important period of learning how to regulate emotions and learning to do it on their own. And we know that children are natural artists, so they dance, they sing, they draw, and there is evidence that they have turned to drawing to help them cope with very stressful situations, the COVID-19 pandemic, Hurricane Katrina. And there is a large body of art therapy literature showing the benefits for children who are, you know, and have experienced some type of trauma or stressor. But in my work with both children and adults, I mean undergraduate students, I wanted to look at how just the simple act of drawing can help regulate our emotions and improve our mood. So in some initial studies, we asked children we do standard mood measures where you present children with 5 faces, asking them to indicate how they're feeling from very happy to very sad. We then take them through a mood induction. So for our adults, we ask them to think of a personally upsetting experience. That's a little too much for a child, so we ask them to think of a disappointing event. We then have them think about that and reflect on it. And then we ask them again how they're feeling. And in my initial studies, I just wanted to compare drawing as a form of distraction versus drawing as a form of expression. So children primarily use distraction as a form of emotion regulation in this age group. So that's why we selected distraction. We have children draw a house or a building. And in the express condition, we know that art does elicit our ability to express ourselves. So we wanted to compare that, have that as a comparison. And in that group, we have children, our condition, we have children draw the event they thought of. So that's their form of expression. And again, we have them rate their mood at the end. And so what we found is that drawing to distract improves mood more than drawing to express. And you may say, well, maybe it's just any distraction task. Maybe we can give them anything to do that's distracting, and that would improve their mood. So in this follow-up study, we compared drawing to distract versus copying objects, which is a distraction task that doesn't really require any type of like creativity. And so we found again that drawing distract improved mood more than the other two conditions, the copying and the express condition. And so in these subsequent studies with children, we've been looking at more, what do children do kind of spontaneously? What are they drawing? How, what do they think about when they're drawing? And what we find is that kind of probing a little deeper to look at, what kind of, what's going on under the surface. What we find is that when you don't give children any instructions on what to draw, they naturally draw as a form of distraction. But there are differences in the type of drawings that they make. So for young children, they're drawing things that they like to do, the things they enjoy. Maybe they like to go to roller coasters or like being with their family. So they're drawing those kind of types of things. And for older children, these like 10 to 12-year-olds, they're drawing more things from like observation or things that they see in their environment. So we're kind of seeing differences there. And with my adult work, we've done a few more studies there, but we have found that these benefits are found for a variety of different affective states: sadness, anxiety, anger. We found the benefits for a single session of drawing as well as longitudinally over several days and a month. And we've also found that, kind of compared to other arts activities, so maybe coloring or writing, that drawing actually improves our mood more so. I'm going to stop there just because I'm just concerned about the fire alarm, but.
Yes, thank you. And please keep yourself safe.
Yeah.
And so, Jessica, some of the work that you do involves people's emotional journeys in museums. And as we've seen this big increase in time spent online and the loneliness epidemic and people not spending so much time with each other as they have in decades past, it seems that museum visits are increasingly important and potentially a powerful way. But how do we show people the impact of those museum visits and sort of tell them that it is worth the investment of their time and potentially a ticket price? So how do you measure people's experiences in museums?
Yeah. So I do a bit of work in museums and then also some school-based programming. But so I'm at the Center for Emotional Intelligence, so it's all kind of based in emotion skills, and it's going to relate a lot to what Thalia and Jen have already shared. But we kind of think of it two ways, which is that your emotional intelligence skills, things like being able to recognize your emotions or other people's emotions, understanding where emotions come from, having a large emotion vocabulary, to bring us back to where we started, right? Being nuanced in describing how you're feeling. And then, of course, being able to express how you're feeling intentionally, and regulate and manage how you're feeling when you want to. That set of skills has a relation to your creative achievement. And so Zorana Ikchevik and I have done a lot of work in this area of kind of articulating the ways in which your skills are going to enhance your creativity. Now, we don't believe that being more emotionally intelligent inherently makes you more creative, but we do think that there are things like frustration tolerance, being able to handle feedback, staying motivated in sort of the drudgery of finishing a project you've started, and even noticing your feelings so that you problem find and notice new ways to be right. Those are all things that can take someone's creative potential and actualize it into creative behavior and creative achievement. And then the other direction, which is I'm more excited to talk about today because it has to do with what we've been doing in museums, is that engaging with art or engaging in creative processes is a way to build these emotion skills, which again is very connected with what everyone else has been sharing. And some of this that we did in museums was that we had I wrote a series of workshops for art gallery in Spain. And then we did a bunch of studies there, and we had children come through every weekend and go through these workshops of engaging with looking at the art, learning about how to interpret art, and then making their own art. And we organized it around feelings. So there was a happy, sad, angry, scared, and calm. And each week they were kind of finding, going on a scavenger hunt of the art gallery and articulating why they thought that this painting or this sculpture represented that, and then making one of their own. So they were building emotional vocabulary, talking about regulation, but also kind of connecting it to this creative expression. And then with adolescents, we did something similar, but it was around photography. And then with adults, we had them come to the museum over a series of weekends to actually pick out art that represented a challenge in their life, and then pick out another piece of art that represented their solution, and then they had to make the piece of art that connects the problem to the outcome, right? So they're generating their own solution. And the idea we were trying to get across was twofold. One is that your emotions are information, right? So we're trying to shift people's mindsets so their emotions are not something that's distracting or making them irrational, or that they should try to suppress or get rid of. But that your emotions are information that tell you about the world and what you think of it. And when you change your relationship with emotions like that, which is what we kind of define as emotional intelligence, it can change a lot about your well-being, because you recognize feelings as sort of less threatening or like existentially threatening. You see them as transient, you see them as useful. And so we wanted adults to be able to recognize that emotions like frustration, anger, sadness, like are telling you something. And then they were using the art in the museum to kind of help them articulate what is it that it's telling me? And then think about, well, how do you want to feel? And then talk about how are we going to shift? So we're building regulation skills. And we found in these studies a couple of things. We were able to see in both the children, the adolescents, and the adults a shift in what we call kind of their emotion mindsets, so that emotions are information as opposed to something that I should be trying to, right? Like leave your emotions at the door when you go to work or school. No, bring them with you. They're important, right? That you can have a growth mindset about your emotion skills. You can get better at this stuff. It's not that we've got people who are good at it and people who aren't good at it. We can grow through theater, through drawing, through art, through practice and instruction at school. And that having unpleasant feelings is an opportunity for a creative solution. So a lot of the work that I've been doing in schools with middle and high school students is looking at that, is looking at how can we take their unpleasant feelings, what they're frustrated about, what they're angry about, what's disappointing to them about their current school experience, and see it as an opportunity for them to come together as a group, a group of students, and we help them through this process. Think about what could they do to enhance that at their school to help solve that problem. And so we see that leads to things like more self-efficacy, creative self-efficacy, but also liking challenges more, being not so afraid, right? Like that a challenge, I've overcome hard things before, I've done hard things before. And so then we can go back to what Thalia was talking about with transfer, which is like, yes, they're doing it in the context of this cute little project for school where they make a bunch of positivity posters, but it's a foundational step in saying, hey, I'm a creative problem solver. And they're more likely to do that the next time they're faced with a challenge. And then, right. And then there's sort of a self-fulfilling, like self-affirming spiral that has to start somewhere. So when we give them those first opportunities to say, hey, I did a thing and I grew from it, that begins what I hope is kind of a lifelong path, right, of continuing to work on yourself, your emotion skills, your creativity skills, and all the things that come with it. I'm going to stop there, but.
Thank you. So for our participants in the webinar, you can use the Q&A function to get us some questions that are generated by some of the things that you've been hearing. And of course, what is the burning question that you have about how do we measure the impact of the arts? Ronnie, I wonder if we could get your reactions to some of the things that you've been hearing here. What are your thoughts?
Sure. So keep in mind that I don't study arts. But, when, these, first of all, the framework that Anjan talked about, while not directly related to the work that I do, because I don't do work in arts and aesthetics, I think there are some parallels that you could draw to creative problem solving, which is the work that I do. So I think it's broader than just arts and aesthetics. And I think integrating those perspectives that come, you know, from creativity on the one hand to arts to aesthetics gives us a much broader perspective. So Thalia, for example, was talking about, you know, does theater help children and adults solve problems? Well, you know, she's studying the empathy behind it, but also we could look at, can they solve these problems more creatively if they have this theater background? Or, you know, linking it to the comedy later, right? Improvisational skills that allow you to solve everyday problems more creatively. Similarly, you know, we talk about creative mindset, just like Jessica mentioned this notion of growth mindsets regarding emotions and emotion as information. How do we use that in creative problem solving? You know, Jen talked about drawing as a mechanism to sort of process, and information processing as an important part of creative problem solving. So I think what I heard from my perspective, even though this is not the area that I study in, there's a lot of potential cross-fertilization that can happen across these different areas of studies that are all related.
Yeah, and I think that that kind of interdisciplinary collaboration is something that obviously is very key and important and a big hot topic in neuroarts in general. I wonder if any of you want to give us some ideas of best practices that you have experienced in your own collaborative endeavors. I know, Anjan, you and I have talked about this in the past, and I think it would be, your perspective here would be really, I think, important for people to understand, and then, you know, anyone else that wants to jump in after that.
Yeah, so I think, I mean, you got a taste of it from the way we developed the taxonomy by bringing experts who are not necessarily in our domain. So that's one piece. But as a day-to-day practice, Indra, you know this, we have an artist in residence in my lab, and we have a senior art historian who has been coming for the last 5 years to most of our lab meetings. We have someone who runs our VR lab, but is trained as an anthropologist, and so he thinks about space in the way in anthropology and archaeologic terms, and he contributes to how we think. And I think one thing about it is, you know, we've talked about vocabulary a couple of times, and interdisciplinary, cross-disciplinary conversations and collaborations, I think, are really hard. And I think we tend to trivialize them by saying, yeah, we should do this. But one potential barrier is the use of language and how we use the same words differently. So just as an example, for our artists in residence, now I've had two, and actually early in the days of these SF, Society for Neuroscience and Creativity events, I was in one of these conversations with Lucas Kelly, who was our artist in residence at the time. But in both cases, what I've done is artist comes in, I know what I don't want. I don't want them to be expert data visualizers. I don't want them to make pretty pictures of the brain. But I don't know what I do want. And so the idea is that the artist comes to the lab meeting for 3 months without us even talking about a project. And they are part of the conversation. They engage in questions. They ask us questions that we typically aren't thinking about. There's a kind of way in which it expands how we think, but also, you know, gives us different perspectives and introduces some degree of humility in what we're doing, because if what we're doing is completely irrelevant to an artist, that's helpful. But I think for us, in our experience, it takes about 3 months before you feel like you're actually talking to someone from another discipline. And after that, we sit down and start talking about what might be a project that we could do together that emerges out of the conversations in the lab, but wasn't predetermined. So at least that's sort of our approach to interdisciplinary work.
Yeah, I have to say I've always really admired Anjan, your artist in residence, and it's like a dream someday that I'd love to do that, a theater maker in residence to do some devised theater around the work that we do too, which would be so fun. I think one thing that I think a lot about when I'm collaborating with schools, with theaters, with artists, is that because there is not a widespread scientific literacy around psychological research, behavioral research, neuroscientific research, everybody is used to seeing the sort of perfect, well-controlled, randomized control trial. Here are the results. It's very clean and clear. X causes Y and Y causes Z, right? We see these singular pretty pictures, these singular mediation models that get sort of put into our papers and then publicized on our blogs or on our social media. And that's the image of what research is that many artists have, many arts organizations have, as well as many students, right, who are just getting into the field and whose entryway into the field has been to read 100 of our published papers and go, great, that's what the research says, and that's what we know about the arts. But the truth of the matter is, for any of us who have been doing this work for any significant amount of time, it's much messier than that, right? It almost never goes from A to B to C, from idea to study to perfect result, and away you go into a publication. And so part of the collaborative process that I've found is really important is to work with artistic organizations in order to understand what their goals are for their interventions and their programs, and then what my tools and techniques are that I can bring to the table in order to help them. So one of the things we've actually been doing as part of the Mason Arts Research Center is we are building out a Research 101 course for arts organizations, because often there's no way that they would know the difference between a randomized control trial, a quasi-experimental longitudinal intervention, a correlational study, and a simple program evaluation, right? Is my program working? Do people like my program? Are people finding themselves more engaged with the arts or more engaged in their communities after they do my program than they were before? That doesn't require a large 5-year randomized control trial, right? That's a program evaluation. And so I think part of the ideas behind collaborations is that often the goals of researchers who are heading towards academic publications, scientific rigor, are different than the goals of arts organizations, which is to find out if they're helping the people they want to help, and if people feel a greater sense of well-being after having done a 6-week improvisational theater course than they did before the 6-week improvisational theater course. So similarly to this idea of vocabulary around what psychological constructs we're even talking about, I think learning what research is and the messiness of the research process is really important to make sure that you're on the same page about what that ultimate outcome is. Because it's very different if you're writing a brochure so that an arts organization can use it for publicity, or can put a singular pretty graph up on their website to try and get an arts grant, than if you're trying to do sort of something with the most amount of control so you can really get at the answer to a single directional hypothesis that would be acceptable in a peer-reviewed publication like PACA.
I think it's also important, just the vocabulary is having these operational definitions of what you're actually looking for. And I have an experience working with an artist creating paintings, and we had 2 different ideas of what a body should look like. We wanted to express emotions. I just assumed that the body would have a face. The artist didn't, and it was a beautiful painting that we couldn't use in our study. So really having kind of, as Thalia said, like helping to educate arts organizations, theater organizations about research, but I think also being clear that what can we give? You know, we're going into these organizations and we're like, it's great that we're doing this research, but like, what can the benefits be for the arts organizations? How can we help them promote their programs? How can we give back as well? So making sure we're just not like researchers going in there and collecting data, but they're actually having them involved, looking at how if we can give a talk or talk to parents, and how we can really be like community partners, I think is really important as well.
I'll just add, there was a comment in the chat about kinds of measures and self-reported outcomes. And so when I think about your question about kind of best practices, I think, yes, for me, anytime that it can be an ability measure over a self-report, I do that. Sometimes they're longer or harder. But especially with emotional intelligence, people are terrible at reporting their own emotional intelligence. Like there's a 0-order correlation between the ability test and their self-report. And sometimes it's negative, where the people who are the worst think that they're good at it because they're bad at reading facial cues or noticing that everyone around them thinks they're not, right? And so we really, really do try to use ability tests, and our center has been building a new suite of these tests because again, they're just not where we want them to be. This is an area where we need diverse faces. We need subtle expressions. We need, they need to be videos and not pictures, because in the real world, you don't have to read someone's emotion off of a picture. You get a face with with micro expressions, and usually they're trying to hide their real feeling and show you something else. And so we've been working really hard on a series of things around that, as well as sort of understanding emotions where we don't just get caught up in a vocabulary test. This is a tricky area, but we have this, as I think about where we're going, that's a lot of what we've been working on. And the other thing I'll mention is anytime that it can be mixed methods, and Thalia, you brought this up too, right? The better. We want to understand what's going on in a creative process. It can't just be that we look at the end product of the thing they made at the end, right? Especially for me, when we're looking at their emotions throughout, I need to know what they were thinking at the beginning. I need to know all the ideas that they rejected before they started. I need to know how much they had to down-regulate to sit down and focus. I need to know where they got frustrated. And so this is an area where I think technology has been really helpful. The work that I've been doing with teams of students in schools, we used to do them as live events where I really only got to see what they did at the end. And now we've got them doing it online where it's all in a discussion board, right? The whole process of what they decided to do and where they stopped and how often they met, right? It's all in there. So yeah, incorporating tech and as much qualitative information as well.
In my adult work, we've also looked at like psychophysiological responses. So looking at heart rate, skin conductance, RSA, to kind of supplement and looking at whether there are difference between the self-report measures and, kind of our physical response. It's tricky when they're drawing, especially with children, they're moving around a lot. So it's sometimes hard to get them to sit still. But with the adults, we've been able to do that successfully.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I mean, I think first of all, I just want to underscore the difference between a self-report measure and a behavioral measure, as you were describing the ability case in Jessica. So those two things are different. Even though the person is still filling out the survey has been designed to track their behavior, not what they think they're doing, not their metacognition,
right.
not their self-report.
Right. Things like I'm good at reading people's faces. Agree, disagree. People are not good at this. Yeah.
That's right. And yet, if you show them a whole bunch of, as you said, videos of faces, you can actually, use that as a measure of how good they actually are at recognizing those faces. And I think that's something, now I do, a lot of my work involves working with corporations or organizations to help them assess some of these elements, either the impact of their work or creativity in general. And I think that is an underappreciated difference, that they just think that, well, I can just ask a bunch of survey questions and I can get the same result as I would, and I sort of say to them, well, no, there's a validated measure, say, of, empathy, reactivity, or emotional reactivity. And there's a reason why it's been validated and why that is better than whatever questions you can come up with, in 10 minutes. But the physiological biomarkers is another, I think, interesting point of conversation. I think a lot of times people find these very compelling, and yet physiology as a measure of at least emotional reactivity is very hard to interpret. So you're going to get the same physiological response and have two very different emotional outcomes. The example I usually give is fear versus excitement. You're going to get very similar. So, and the amount of work and in terms of data collection, data noise, signal to noise, pulling out, et cetera, is very expensive and time consuming to get at something that you could ask someone, well, are you feeling fear or are you feeling excitement? Compared to like, okay, well, let's look at the very subtle differences in these biomarkers. That seems to be my impression of where the state of the field is right now, even with a lot of these, mobile EEG or Neurable or other sort of trackers. Do any of you have any of you found a biomarker that you feel is actually an underappreciated tool that a lot of us who are in this field should actually be looking more into?
I think our experience is very much like yours, Indra, which is that if we collect physiology, we also collect subjective information, right? You can't, I think the further you get from the central nervous system, the coarser the measure is. These are broad sympathetic, parasympathetic responses that can be generated for a variety of reasons.
Yeah. Okay. I'm
And
glad I'm not missing anything major.
I'll say too that if you work with children, there isn't enough of a research base to even be able to collect and understand what's happening, except at the very sort of broadest level, cortisol and then also, a lot of these measures have only been normed on certain populations in the United States and other Western cultures. And so as soon as you get into any of the other global majority countries, we don't necessarily have biomarker norms. And so it is, I think, dangerous to make sort of universal assumptions about what the CNS is doing based on biomarkers that have been normed in the United States or other Western cultures.
Mm-hmm.
So to pick up on that, if I could ask Jessica a question, this whole idea of facial expressions and micro expressions is fascinating to me. How much of that is subject to what Thalia is talking about of cultural norms, and how do you deal with that?
A lot is, yeah, it varies dramatically across cultures, right? So we have started in the US, but yeah, we have, even in the United States, right? We tried to have a range of diverse people, and then we tried to have them, it was actually, we hired actors, which didn't even work because even actors can't do this, which we should talk to Thalia about, right? Because we were like, you're feeling fear, but you're going to pretend it's whatever, because that's what people do in real life, right? It's not like the tests that exist now are like anger, which is like, that's nobody, right? They tend to be the stereotypes of emotions, not the actual prototypes of what most people feel. And so those tests are useless. But yes, it varies dramatically across cultures. We have to be very careful. A lot of the work that we do in schools is exactly that, which is helping teachers recognize that there's, many people coming in, and eye contact means respect. Lack of eye contact means respect, right? Call and response means I'm paying attention. Call and response is rude because you didn't raise your hand. They're all coming into your room, and we talk about kind of starting out being an emotions scientist, right? Learning about each person and the way that they're expressing and what their intentions are, because it's going to vary dramatically. There really is no, this is what that feeling looks like.
So we have a couple of other conversations going on in the chat. Ronnie, I wonder if you want to talk a little bit about the creative problem solving, and if there are any approaches here that are applicable to how organizations think about creativity and innovation within their own workforces.
Yeah, and David brought up a good point that, when you mention creativity to organizations, they usually go, oh, that's artistic stuff, and we don't do arts, and we don't want to do artist stuff, and so trying to but the word innovation is something that they understand. And if you look at the literature in entrepreneurship or in innovation, really the early parts of innovation are what we call creativity, right? It's how do we identify the problem? What is the problem we're trying to solve? What information do we need? Generating ideas, combining ideas, and then we evaluate them and implement them. And that's really the innovation part. I find that approaching it that way seems to work. And talking to them about the fact that you could have creativity and innovation in very simple, all walks of life, right? So sort of removing that barrier that creativity is something that only exists in arts and maybe science. And it's we could solve problems creatively, whether it's a conflict with a coworker or, frankly, some of my most creative ideas were in how to manage my children. And they still remind me of this to this day. right? And they're in their 20s and 30s. So, you know, everyday problems can have creative solutions. And therefore, if we implement them in organizations, if we try to solve the problem in the routine way and it's not working, let's try to think about solutions creatively. And there are areas where we know we need creativity. So in that respect, organizations are receptive when you talk about creative problem solving and making decisions that would facilitate creativity and innovation. What I find is that they're not always receptive to the work that needs to happen in order for that to happen, right? So you need to give people time to think or experiment. Well, we can't do that, right? We don't have the time. We're putting out fires. We don't have the budget. So that's where, you know, things sort of tend to fall a little bit apart in terms of organizations. But in principle, they're interested. And in some organizations that they really find that approach very, very useful. We could also tie it to design thinking and entrepreneurship. Or really design thinking, if you look at it, involves much of what we talk about in terms of cognitive processes of creativity. But it's something that organizations may be more comfortable with.
Yeah, it's interesting what you're describing. Kind of, there are sort of two sides of the same problem potentially. One is in the arts organizations, sometimes we have this conflict between, as you were discussing, what the arts organization's goals are in terms of the outcomes of the research and how we as researchers feel that we can contribute to the larger national conversation, or, you know, the understanding the impact of the arts and their value. And in organizations, it's almost like we have to come in as researchers and show them that it's important, that it can actually improve their bottom line before, instead of them coming to us and saying, well, what can we do to make ourselves more innovative? I feel like there's a bit of in the arts organizations, there's already a feeling or a motivation that we know this is impactful. We want to understand how, whereas in the corporations, we still are in the place where we still have to show them how this is something that can improve their bottom line. We have about 10 minutes left in this panel, so I just want to remind people, if you have questions, please put them in either the Q&A or the chat.
Can I add something to what you just said real
yeah.
quick? I just want to say that in school systems, one of the things that I found helpful is when you talk about helping people learn creative problem solving, you're not coming in with the answer to their problems, right? You're saying, like, your community knows, you know, but I'm just going to give you a framework or a process or some skills. And I find that opens a lot of doors in places that generally would not, you know, they don't want you to come in with the answer.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, I think that's very valuable.
And I think this also goes back to this question of transfer and talking about transfer, right? Because there's questions in organizations, there's questions in corporations, arts organizations, and schools about, okay, if you're going to do this one kind of activity, is this going to affect this other kind of outcome that I'm particularly interested in? So part of what I sort of see our job as researchers is to talk about, well, what are underlying or foundational abilities, right? We can go as basic as attention or perception. We can go complex with like collaboration and, you know, sense of playfulness or sense of imagination, right? And so often it is also about not convincing them that any particular creative intervention or creative measurement strategy is going to be the silver bullet, right? That solves all the problems that you're having in your particular school or your particular organization, but thinking about sort of what the beauty of the arts is that they are complex, which means they have lots of different components that can be applied in lots of different ways. I often talk about a flexible toolkit, right? You can use different kinds of visual arts exercises, different kinds of theater exercises, different kinds of creative interventions for different kinds of outcomes. So once you have a good sense of what that goal is that you're trying to get to, once you've well defined the problem, then you can start to get an idea of how your particular form of measurement or your particular form of artistic intervention or artistic activity can be shaped and molded towards that problem, right? In the education world, we have arts intervention specialists, but then we also have arts integration specialists, right? Teaching artists that come in and use tools and techniques like drama-based pedagogy, where you're in a science classroom doing theater activities that are uniquely focused for the topics in that classroom. So it's not always do your art or do your creative practice, and then you'll have some extra outcome, that strict transfer. It's about also the integration and sort of melding of tools and techniques from an artistic way of knowing with tools and techniques with the kind of way of knowing that's productive and useful for your corporation or your organization.
Mm-hmm.
I just want to add, I think it's also making the distinction between the tools that can help you learn a particular topic, but also having these arts that maybe it's not going to benefit science, but maybe it benefits children's social and emotional learning, which will help them better in the classroom, and that they might have these indirect benefits.
So we have Rhonda asking for short reading lists from our panelists. I don't think that's something we can do on the fly. But Rhonda, we will work on that for our next newsletter. And if you want to email us directly, you can email me at tsfnc@gmail.com, and I can sort of help coordinate that. That sounds like it would be really useful. Ed Vessel is asking about how we get from the dimensions of art experience, so using Anjan's framework, to the types of outcomes that we think might impact health and well-being. So I think this is kind of the through line behind the kind of basic science understanding the sort of how this thing works to how it impacts our health and well-being. Anjan, do you have any advice for how people might utilize your framework to sort of choose outcomes or develop outcomes?
God, I wish I knew the answer to that. That's the $1 million question, which I'm surprised Ed's asking that. Just so a couple of thoughts. This goes back to this, to Jennifer's thing about expressive sort of drawing for expression, which I would love to hear more about, and whether that's something that can be trained. And part of the reason I asked that is that we have used our taxonomy in a project looking at veterans with post-traumatic stress symptoms, but it's embedded within an art therapy program. So people in that, they use a papier-mâché mask, do a kind of self-portrait on a papier-mâché mask at the beginning and after therapy. And the idea there is that many people with post-traumatic stress have a hard time articulating what their emotional state is, right? But they find it easier to put this into a mask, and then they go through therapy, and then they produce a mask at the end of this. And what we've been able to show, in this case, the taxonomy is used as an index of change. So we can crowdsource these masks and have people who are completely blinded to which masks were made before and after, and show that people can read out, using the taxonomy, a difference in state from the mask before and after. So it's using the taxonomy as an index of change, but our therapy, the whole program, is the vehicle for change and transformation. So it might not be exactly what Ed is driving at, but it's a way, once you have a tool and a measure, you can use it in many different ways.
I wonder if we, with a little time we have left, can talk about this idea of transformation. So we've heard a lot about transfer from one context to another, but of course, the arts, one of their key selling points is that they supposedly transform us. So how do we operationalize that transformation? Is it domain specific? Is it through some of these other measures? How do we show that transformation has occurred?
I think in an educational context, one thing I think about a lot is self-efficacy. and this belief that you can engage in the kinds of activities and practices that maybe you thought you couldn't before, right? So similarly to how we were talking about before, that giving somebody the vocabulary of an aesthetic experience might enable them to then have a deeper understanding of that aesthetic experience. I think giving students and children an understanding that they do have the capacity for creative thought, that they do have the capacity for playfulness, for artistry, right? And showing them how there's not a right or wrong answer to a particular response to a prompt, or that this is a way that you can express yourself, and then allowing them to gain this sense of self-efficacy through engaging these kinds of behaviors, then makes it more likely that they will engage in those behaviors going forward. And that's how transformation happens. I actually am not a believer in the idea of a single artistic experience transforming you in any way at all. I think it's iterative and additive, that you bring each experience into the new one, and then as you build those multiple experiences over time, you are transformed.
I think there's also a role for when it's educational like this, being explicit about it at the end, right? Like, what did you learn? How did you grow? How could you use that in other places, and having those conversations with children, right? That's like, okay, so here we used it, right, in this way. But when you have to stand up in front of class and share something, that's going to be the same skill, right? And when you get, a flat tire and you're stuck, oh, that's going to be the same skill. And just help make those connections.
I think also with Jessica too, thinking about, you don't have to have the right answer that you mentioned earlier, but allowing children to have any adults time to like experiment and like self-discovery. And I agree with Thalia, like multiple arts experiences in multiple domains, not just one domain, because I feel that those really do add up and really do transform you as a person. Yeah.
Anjan, any thoughts?
I was in a conference here at Penn on spirituality and aesthetics, and this question of transformation, I think, is really important, and I think one that we're struggling with. Like, what is being transformed? What is what comes out on the other side of that? And how do we measure that? How do we identify that? How do we even know what it is we're looking for when it comes to transformation? So I'm not saying anything particularly sensible other than underscoring. I think this is a really an important question for us as a community.
And I think also there's the element of the transformation sounds like forevermore you will never be the same, as opposed to, it might transform you for 6 weeks or a year or 2 years, but who knows how long that will last. So I want to let our webinar participants know that our next session, Navigating Careers in Creativity Research, will begin in 15 minutes. There is a Zoom link in the chat if you want to join us. If you haven't registered, please feel free to join us. And if you instead want to, or in addition to talk about something funny and how humor and comedy works and how that relates to creativity, that's our session a little bit later this afternoon or evening if you are in Europe. Ronnie, thank you so much for co-hosting this panel with me, and thank you to our panelists, Anjan, Thalia, Jessica, and Jen, for this conversation. This conversation will be recorded or has been recorded, I should say, and will be available. So thank you all very much.
Thank you, everybody, for participating and coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks all, and hopefully see most of you in about 15 minutes. Bye-bye.
Bye.